Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. I'm Max Perry. I'll be your host for the day. I'm an independent journalist and writer. My work is currently syndicated in Covert Action magazine, so you can read my writing there. And with me, as always, is my co-host and also our producer, Shaenah Batterson. Hi, Shaenah.
Hi, Max. Good to be with you again today.
Yeah, got a lot to discuss today. A lot happened over the weekend. We're going to be focusing on one aspect of all the current unrest in this country. But before we get into that, Shayna is also a writer as well. Everyone should check out her Substack, The Red Letter. It's really great, and she's also got a forthcoming article out coming out next month in CAM as well. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Today, though, we're going to be discussing the issue of immigration, which, of course, has been very much in the news lately. And, there's been, unless you've been living under a rock, there have been these ongoing ICE raids. And in light of the recent riots and protests in Los Angeles that mobilized in response to those highly publicized ICE raids going on under the Trump administration, we wanted to address, some of the complexities of the issue and interrogate its root causes, which I believe have really seemingly gotten lost in the whole discourse and public conversation. And it seems to be the thing that the proponents on both sides, both of these really harsh immigration restrictions, as well as the abolish ICE crowd. They equally both seem to be neglecting, where the root of the matter, the heart of the matter, and where the entire immigration question, it's to the point where it's been framed now within this duopoly as like a duopoly culture war issue. And meanwhile, the underlying reasons for the whole immigration crisis, if you want to call it that, continue to go unaddressed. And it's just being used as this political football by the two major parties. And we also wanted to get into, explored the validity of these claims by critics of the protests, both on the right and the left, that what's going on is like a color revolution, or that they're inauthentic, and that they're, which has really been an ongoing theme in the whole Trump era. The same thing was the case in 2020 during the George Floyd protests, Black Lives Matter. And certainly that same question can be raised, I think, in fact, a lot more so for these No Kings protests that happened over the weekend as well.
Yeah,
Um,
actually, funnily enough, Mark Fisher, a BLM executive director, he voted for Trump in 2024 because he came to view the Democrats as opportunists, taking advantage of vulnerable communities and not coming through with their promises. Uh, and he actually accused the anti-Trump protesters of being sore losers, viewing the No Kings protests as seeming like something straight out of Soros's playbook. I didn't realize this until the other day, but I thought that was kind of funny.
well, I think you could say that about, I mean, there are a lot of people in the Black community that were very, very disappointed with, Biden, basically ran on and, hijacked that movement. And, there was supposed to be this legislation passed to reform police and mass incarceration and all that. And of course, it never happened. And I think a lot of Black people felt like, they're just being used every 4 years as this demographic to win elections but their communities just continued to go that are neglected, and there's no substantive policy or bill passed to address any of this stuff. And in turn, I think, I mean, first of all, those No Kings protests, I mean, I think it's ridiculous that, I mean, as absurd as that parade was, I mean, and really humiliating, it made the US military look ridiculous. I mean, they couldn't even, they're clearly they were not into it. I mean, the marching was totally out of sync with each other, and the tank was even making a weird noise, one of the tanks, and it was just pathetic display. It was not like any kind of display of military might that like an actual dictator would have, at least as far as I'm concerned. But I think it just encapsulates
No,
the
no,
le
no. Trump's literally Hitler, remember?
yeah. I mean, it's just absurd. I mean, the fact that people will protest a military parade, but they won't protest war that's going on. But anyway, um,
Well, also, the No Kings protests were calling again back to 2016 again, I guess, to remove Trump from office. But technically, Trump is the democratically elected president.
yeah,
So,
yeah, the implications for that are not good. I mean, as terrible as he is democratically elected, and so I mean, they want to impeach him, I guess, for a third time when that really doesn't amount to anything. But anyway, um, getting back to the immigration issue, I mean, I think it's important to note that the increase of funding for ICE is bipartisan. But this issue is really being disingenuously framed. In fact, if you look at the statistics for the fiscal year budgets in recent years, the funding for ICE has steadily increased no matter who's been in office, including Biden. And, although he's only been in office since January, Trump has actually been deporting people at a slower rate and monthly average than Biden's final year in office. As far as the explanation for that, I think it's complicated. I've seen interviews with Trump's border czar, who said that the reasons for that is because the enforcement at the entry points on the border is stricter under Trump, and that under Biden, larger numbers were caught crossing illegally, so that therefore it gave ICE more people to deport as far as the numbers go. But, regardless, Trump did campaign pledging to deport more immigrants in what is supposed to be, he campaigned pledging to carry out the largest deportation program in US history. I don't know how he's going to be able to outdo Obama, who deported 3 million people, but never, these ICE raids and this immigration crackdown, though, I think is really casting a wide net, and they're clearly not just going after criminals as claimed. They're going after farm workers, they're going into schools and hotels and restaurants, Home Depot parking lots. And of course, this has provoked a strong reaction in cities, in Southern California, especially. I actually grew up in Southern California, and actually, what's taking place in LA was foreshadowed in San Diego first, which is where I'm from. But it didn't get quite the same amount of attention. Basically, in late last month, in this area I lived in for many years. I mean, it was in South Park, but I grew up in the Golden Hill area, which is adjacent to it, but it's basically the same area. But in this part of central San Diego, there were two, or central southeast San Diego, there were these two Italian restaurants that were swarmed by ICE agents, and people, I guess, spontaneously rallied to the scene. They were going in there and getting these people that worked, I guess, in the kitchen or the service capacity, and crowds gathered, around where they were these rounding up these service workers and shouting them down, as ICE detained and zip tied them. And they're in full tactical gear, militarized, and they reacted to the crowd by using flashbang grenades, trying to disperse them as their vehicles were surrounded by the crowd. And this is a preview of what later took place in LA, just on a much bigger scale. And, I think that the media really is apart from the law enforcement itself, I think that the media is really playing a big role here because, I know that there's this theme from 2020 and the George Floyd protests, about mostly peaceful protests. But my understanding, if you look at the most of the anti-ICE protests, at least in the beginning that were happening the last few weeks, they were actually mostly peaceful, at least in the beginning. And actually, the rioting that's going on, it's really not that different from, like, for example, the last year the LA Dodgers won the World Series. Fuck the Dodgers, by the way. But after that, there were buses set on fire. There was social unrest. There was people looting businesses. There was all kinds of mayhem in downtown Los Angeles. But of course, the response to that by the police is much less brutal. The crackdown is much less severe. It's not really that much different than riots that happened, in Philly when the Eagles won the Super Bowl. But of course, because it's politicized, the police response is a lot different. But actually, the media coverage, I think, is really contributing to the inflaming of these protests, which started out small and they grew in size. And as the TV cameras descended on them, I think it really set the stage for this ongoing standoff. And on the one hand, you've got the Democrats who are capitalizing on this and their affiliated media saying that, of course, the response is justified and popular and spontaneous. And then you've got the Fox News and One America and, conservative media depicting it as treasonous and that these are just a bunch of illegal immigrants looting businesses, stores, and rioting. And both sides are just really miscontextualizing the whole issue. And people need to ask themselves here, where was this coverage under Biden? You know, and from the liberal media, I mean. Um, and I think, when people say that this is a color revolution, no matter what politics they have, where it's coming from, I think there is a kernel of truth to that, in that this issue of immigration is clearly being used to advance other grievances, of factions within the establishment, that they have against Trump that doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with immigration. And this is
I,
exactly what happened in 2020 with George Floyd, where this popular anger about a legitimate issue, like whether it's immigration or police brutality against Black Americans, it's being weaponized for other purposes. So I think to that extent, it could be characterized as, whatever you want to call it, a color revolution or a manufactured or engineered movement.
I think it, especially since the protests are taking place in California, and for a while, prior to this, I've seen people saying that like Gavin Newsom is very likely going to be the next Democratic presidential candidate. And then with the way, Trump's calling in the National Guard, and then Newsom's like, no, I don't want you to do that. And it's
Mhm.
gonna make him sort of look like some sort of a hero. And as it is, the two-party paradigm dynamic, Trump with his policies of Doge and making all these cuts, these are
Mhm.
neoliberal cuts on government programs that the ruling class has wanted for a while. But just having Trump do it then can leave the Democratic Party blameless and put faith in it. And that's why I think the two-party system is really damaging to any sort of potential for revolution, because it corrals movements into either side just by the way that it works.
Yeah, I think that that's clearly the case, and I do think that they're grooming, and they have been grooming Newsom for a while. Whether or not that ends up happening, I don't know. Um, but I think that that's definitely valid, and it's just turned into this political chess game. It's very cynical. And meanwhile, like the actual issue itself, I think really gets lost in all this. And of course, the militarized police presence and this Gestapo tactics by ICE are really an awful display. They're targeting very vulnerable people. who are just trying to work and make a better life for themselves, who pay taxes and are a very vital part of the American economy and make it go. And of course, people are right to be upset by this. However, I did want to discuss one other aspect of the protests because one of the things I couldn't help but notice about them, as they were mobilizing in LA and then they disintegrated into this full-scale rioting, was the way that they are addressing the immigration issue, or rather the messaging in the protest signs and the various groups organizing them. And one of the main slogans that's, you can't avoid seeing and that's really ubiquitous is this slogan, "No one is illegal," or "No human is illegal." And there's also, you'll also see the variant like "No one is illegal on stolen land," which is of course in reference to the colonial history of the United States and the genocide of the indigenous. But I wanted to get into this slogan because although it's something, it sounds, it has a very nice ring to it. And I think, but if you look into it, this slogan, which is, it's kind of broad. I mean, what does that really mean? No one is illegal. I mean, and how does it really address the issue? If you look into the history of it, actually, if you look it up, the first historical instance, or the person that seemingly coined it, is this Romanian Jewish American writer and activist, Elie Wiesel, who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner and a Holocaust survivor. He wrote a book published in 1960, I believe, called Night, about his experiences when he was very young at Auschwitz and Buchenwald, the Nazi concentration camps. And he was he was in the Oprah book club, made all these appearances on Oprah. He was one of the main figures who established the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. He's on the board of the Human Rights Foundation. He's a darling of the press. Um, and he basically is this very important and visible and influential figure in what I would call the human rights industry, which really, anyone who knows anything about the NGO human rights industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, that's something that Western imperialism actually has really weaponized and used the plight of minority groups and alleged genocides that are said to have taken place around the world to achieve the Western foreign policy agenda. And he was a big, major propagandist, basically, for the propaganda about the Bosnian and Rwandan genocides, which of course were really civil wars that were very politicized in the West and used to manufacture this narrative and advance Western foreign policy interests. And also the rights of the indigenous groups in Nicaragua, like the Mosquitos, which were used to target the Sandinistas, socialist government there, and on and on. I mean, also he was a big, proponent of the rights of who were supposedly of Jews in the Soviet Union. They were supposedly being discriminated against there. It was really that there was immigration restrictions on whether they could make Aliyah to Israel. Um, and of course, the USSR was really demonized as far as being anti-Semitic, supposedly, when it was really because they were in solidarity with the Palestinians, not obviously in the beginning, but later on they were. And I think that the fact that this guy, if you look at him, he was also a huge defender of Israel and a rabid Zionist. Actually, in his youth, Elie Wiesel, he tried to join the Irgun, which was a Zionist terrorist organization, and one of the ones that later ended up forming to become the IDF with other Zionist terrorist groups like the Stern Gang and the Leahy and so on. And actually bombed the Irgun were the ones that bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem when it was mandatory Palestine under the British. And, when you look at a slogan like this, no one is illegal. I mean, you can't help but notice, I mean, the first Jewish settlers that came to Palestine, they did so as illegal immigrants. Now, I'm not trying to compare the immigrants crossing the southern border, of course, to the Jewish settlers in Palestine. But you can see why an extreme Zionist like Weisel would come up with a slogan like that. Because during his lifetime, he was a fanatical supporter of Israel. And in his later years, he even criticized the Obama administration when there were these very moderate resolutions passed criticizing the expansion of the settlements under Netanyahu in East Jerusalem. Um, but so this is who that slogan comes from. This a Zionist who could not recognize that the genocide that Israel is committing against the Palestinians, was an example of that. Now, I'm not comparing, obviously, the illegal immigrants or immigrants coming across the southern border in the United States to the Zionist settlers in Palestine. But, and of course, I know that many of the people in LA who are protesting are very pro-Palestinian. And they have no idea about the origins of that slogan. And I'm sure they'd be appalled if they knew. And of course, slogans can be adopted and take on different meanings and mean many different things to many different people. This guy doesn't have copyright ownership of it. And most of the people demonstrating against ICE, you'll see are wearing keffiyehs, and there's a lot of overlap in the two causes, the pro-Palestinian movement in this country and these people demonstrating against the ICE raids. But I do think that it's revealing in the sense that, at the end of the day, it's a completely meaningless platitude and slogan. And it's not a sufficient answer to the immigration question, which is a very complex issue. And like I said before, of course, these raids are casting a very wide net and are targeting much more than criminals and are harassing people who are hardworking, tax-paying, and in some cases, even citizens are getting caught up in it. And there have been many cases recently, especially of actual citizens or green card holders getting caught up in this. But a slogan like that, which is very nebulous, it's very incomplete. It doesn't fully address the full complexities of the immigration issue. And the bottom line is, among the people, who are being targeted by ICE, obviously not all of them, but many of them are not here legally, whether we like the law, whether we agree with the laws or not. And how does a slogan like that really address the matter or help them? And because it has this implicit suggestion that's very unclear. I mean, are we saying that there should be no immigration laws at all? Should there be no nations or any kind of sovereignty? This is separate from the brutality and the inhumanity of what ICE is doing. I mean, these are important questions that have to be addressed. And of course, if you ask the average person on the liberal left or, proponents of liberal multiculturalism or anarchists, of course, they will say that there shouldn't be any nations or any sovereignty, really. But regardless, how does such a moralist catchphrase address the why and the how, that these immigrants came to be here in this country and came in very desperate circumstances, where they're often exploited as cheap sources of labor. I mean, shouldn't the issue be, to address or tackle the root causes of why they're coming here and trying to change those social conditions? It seems like when the pro-immigration movement is dominated by a slogan like that, it seems to, I think, affect the quality of the discourse around it,
I think
because
that
these people should not be having to leave their countries of origin in the first place. I mean, and instead it's just let them in, which is all well and fine, but what about the heart of the matter that's causing them to want to immigrate? And now it's almost like stigmatized to the point where if you even ask that question, that you're somehow opposed to people coming here, or that you're a racist, or that you're suggesting that there's something wrong with immigration itself, which of course is not true. But the circumstances in which people are coming here, which is in many cases not really voluntary, it's coercively because of the poverty that they're escaping, the wars that they're fleeing, whatever it is. If you even raise that question, it's like it's not even allowed, and that you're going to be called a racist. So, um,
I think that the use of that slogan with this issues, it sort of relates back and it's telling about, I feel like the state of the left today with a lot of people is that these issues, the responses to these political issues is to have a emotional moralizing response instead of stepping back and addressing the issue analytically, because which I think makes people easier to manipulate if it's just going based on trying to be inclusive or make other people feel good instead of actually stepping back and analyzing what's really going on. Because it for the capitalists, having just it is, this is where I think there's sort of a contention between different members of the ruling class, because some of them really do want just the open borders because a lot of people coming in, especially if they are illegal and undocumented, it's a cheap, easily exploited labor force. And the
mhm.
people aren't accounted for. You don't, they can get injured on the job, but because they're not documented citizens, they don't have the same protections. So these people thinking that they're siding with these immigrants in a way are siding against them because that just letting them into what to be exploited by you know
Yeah, I mean, it's fine to, I think, of course, even have relaxed immigration, or that people should be welcome here. But if you're advocating that, but you're also not raising the questions of why people are coming here under such dire circumstances in the first place, and you're neglecting that, you're tacitly supporting the imperialism, the globalization, the things that are causing people in these countries to want to leave. And then in turn, the people who are neglecting that and just advocating, these harsh immigration restrictions, which are some of the strictest in the world, and these Gestapo-like ICE raids, they're both neglecting the heart of the matter, and they're both wrong, and neither one of them is going to solve the immigration problem. You're not going to be able to stop people trying to come here, no matter how strict immigration rules you have, with this beefing up the border patrol and creating ICE. I mean, that's another thing that gets lost in this whole conversation. I mean, ICE is a subsidiary of the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, I remember when that department was created after 9/11, that it was controversial. And now it's just accepted that it's here to stay. And the slogan is not even abolish the DHS, it's just abolish ICE. You know, well, we're still going to have the Border Patrol. They're just going to create another mechanism to do what they're doing. I mean, yes, I mean, I'm all for getting rid of ICE, but the whole Homeland Security Department is unconstitutional and should never have been created in the first place. Um, but there's this prioritization on the left now of just protecting immigrants and marginalized groups from ICE and the Border Patrol, which of course is a valid concern. But meanwhile, the sources of what's driving the immigration crisis is left unaddressed. And in fact, there's this denial on the left that it's even a crisis at all. If you refer to it as that, the response is like, whoa, you have a problem with immigrants coming here? I mean, and you get these, it just invites all these knee-jerk allegations of racism. But yes, it is a crisis. These people are coming here and they're exploited. They are, uh, especially they're coming under very dire circumstances which don't really enable them to assimilate, and they're just fulfilling this labor need to the economy, performing jobs where their earnings are well below the poverty level, and they're in this precarious status where they're living in fear of being deported, which makes them vulnerable to exploitation by employers. They have no legal recourse. They end up working in very dangerous conditions and are susceptible to wage theft, all kinds of discrimination and abuse, and they're often underpaid. Actually, that includes sexual abuse. There's a huge problem with undocumented women being sexually assaulted in the workplace, working as janitors in hotels, in malls, banks, offices across the country. There's a huge problem with them being sexually assaulted, and they can't do anything about it. They can't report it to the police because they're here illegally. And this response by the left is just this virtue signaling and this advocacy of liberal multiculturalism, with these empty slogans like no one is illegal. And, people are willing to recognize how they contribute to the economy and the significant role they play in the workforce, which is all well and fine. Everyone recognizes that. Unfortunately, the right doesn't, but as soon as the conversation shifts to whether or not they should be in this position at all in the first place, it's like it's become stigmatized where if you even raise that question, you are somehow anti-immigration. And it gets shut down by this miscontextualization of the issue. And this kind of discourse has come to dominate the discussion around immigration, where it's just been transformed into this culture war issue. And I think that that slogan really is emblematic of that. And it kind of shows how the left now is just sort of allowing the right wing to dictate the entire terms of the debate and is on the defensive, where it's just about protecting immigrants, rather than, you know, the left defining the discussion and making it about changing the policies, the economic policies of the US, the foreign policy, and the social conditions that US imperialism causes in these countries, forcing people to immigrate under these circumstances in the first place. And somehow we're at the point where even raising this question is controversial now when it really shouldn't be.
Yeah, if we look at the sort of the global dynamic of it, the United States goes about doing imperialism, destroying other countries, destabilizing their governments, plundering their resources, making the countries poor and dependent. And then when you have people coming in from poor countries, especially illegally, then they drive the wages down, incentivize employers not to make better working conditions because they don't have to make better working conditions because then the people they're employing don't have legal protections. And then, two, it becomes a way of, pitting the working class against immigrants because, oh, they're taking my job and they're making my wages go down. And it becomes this, divide and conquer, where instead of, people addressing going, well, this isn't because it's not because of the immigrants, it's because of the way the capitalist system works. That's the problem. It all becomes very obfuscatory, I think.
Yeah, and even raising that question is very controversial. I mean, officially, like mainstream economists deny that immigration keeps wages down. And I'm not an economic expert. I don't know really. I mean, but my instincts tell me that it has to have some impact. I don't know. It's obviously the real reason that wages are down is because, I mean, wages in general have been stagnant in this country since the 70s. They have certainly haven't kept pace with the standard of living. The federal minimum wage hasn't been raised since 2009. In individual states, it's been raised. But I think even adjusted for inflation, it hasn't really been raised at all, and it's gone down. I mean, not, and definitely hasn't been raised at the national level in over 15 years. But to me, it something tells me that it probably does at least have some impact because, why would a business or employer pay someone a fair living wage when they can have someone work more hours for a lot less. And I don't think that obviously people who are in the country illegally can't work certain kinds of jobs, but but they're relegated to certain types of very difficult work that a lot of Americans do not want to do. And there's like a really implicit racism that comes to the surface whenever you talk about this with liberals, because they basically almost admit, like, don't you know that these people, like, I've observed a lot of the debates online and just in my daily life between people who are for stricter immigration laws and people who are, for open borders or whatever. And there's this very implicit racism by the proponents of open borders that comes out, because they'll basically acknowledge that there's like almost like this slave economy where well, they'll say to these Trumpists, like, what, do you want to go pick strawberries? Like, as if that's what these people are here, that like that's the part of the economy, like the function that they serve. And like, who's going to deliver my food? And of course that's true. That these people do uh, fulfill that economic need, but that's not a good thing. Okay, like that's not something that we should be supporting. um of course, like, do you and I want to go work in the fields in California under terrible conditions? No, but no one should have to do that. um so it's just like the whole quality of the discussion by the two major parties
It
is
reminds
so toxic.
it actually reminds me quite a bit of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which was his book about the work. Actually, I think the main character and his family were immigrants from somewhere in Europe in the book. I can't remember where.
I believe it's
But
Eastern Europe.
yeah, and they the main character goes to work in a slaughterhouse, and
Got it right here.
he really he I think he gets injured and gets unemployed, and it's sort of, the whole book basically is about the horrible working conditions and the hyper exploitation, and that main character ends up getting radicalized and becoming like a socialist. But at the time, the book, I believe it actually led to the creation of the FDA, didn't it? Because people,
Yeah, I mean, the I know what you're getting at, because actually that book, in colleges today and in high schools, I mean, mostly colleges is where you're going to read it, but it's a classic, and it's become a standard for people to read, as far as the canon goes. And I had read that book before I had gone to college, but it was so amazing because the way it's taught in classrooms in the United States, they mostly only have you read the first section, which is about the industrial scale slaughter of animals, when the whole fucking point of the book was about drawing attention. I mean, of course, that's a valid part of it, the treatment of animals, but the whole point of the book was about the labor conditions and, the exploitation of workers and immigrants. And that's what the real point of the book was. And it's very mistaught or taught in this very myopic way in the U.S. educational curriculum.
and and purposefully so, I most probably. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's especially the way Upton Sinclair used it with the slaughterhouse, because in a way, the slaughterhouse and the treatment of the animals is kind of a metaphor for the treatment of the working class.
Hmm.
And I think there's just this innate hypocrisy in people that will, they'll hear about factory farms and be all worried about the animals, but not at all think about the workers, because it's still to this day, I mean, a lot of those slaughterhouses, it's horrible jobs, with high injury rate, terrible working conditions. And it is oftentimes like poor immigrants who work those jobs. And so people, they're all upset about the cows, but not about the people working there. It's
Yeah. No, I mean, that's definitely emblematic of a lot. And it is deliberate the way that book is is mistaught. But I think that, many people have really just observing these protests and these riots. I think it's easy to forget that, and many people have forgotten that once upon a time, the left has had problems for decades, but it wasn't that long ago that the left did address the root causes of the immigration crisis, at least to the extent that there was at one time, as recently as the early 2000s and the 90s, uh, a very significant anti-globalization movement that peaked during the late 90s with the Battle of Seattle, which was the big anti-WTO protests in 1999 in Seattle, Washington, which saw tens of thousands of demonstrators against the World Trade Organizations. And if you look at these recent protests in LA, there's virtually no mention of free trade or globalization. I mean, it's almost treated like it's just here to stay. And of course, there's nothing we can do about the fact that there's nothing necessarily even inherently bad about having a globalized economy. But the criticism of that in relation to the immigration issue, which it's totally wrapped up in and intertwined with, is absent from these protests. I mean, the left also really used to focus on the impact that these trade agreements, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, had on both American workers, in terms of the outsourcing of jobs and the deindustrialization of this country and the Rust Belt. NAFTA, for example, gave incentive to companies with its reduced trade barriers in which they relocated to Mexico, where labor costs were a lot lower in the factories there, the maquiladora sector, and it eliminated industrial tariffs, which also now is apparently something that the left opposes. That I don't get at all either. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the way that Trump is implementing them, but this idea that tariffs are bad, I'm just like, oh my God. Um, I mean, the ability for companies to relocate their manufacturing plants was enabled by NAFTA. It totally undercut worker bargaining power domestically because companies could just pick up and leave. And the effects of this kind of economic warfare had on the developing world. I mean, there's great resources out there about this. One example, there's a documentary about Jamaica called Life in Debt, which shows the effects of the IMF and the World Bank's structural adjustment programs on the island. There's also a great book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, who was uh, an economist for a consulting firm who was dispatched to third world countries and tasked with convincing their leaders to accept these development loans for engineering and construction projects, which were then, of course, contracted to U.S. multinational corporations and gave the U.S. government political and economic influence disproportionately and exclusive access to these countries' resources, their natural resources. And they install this comprador elite and it lines their pockets, the ruling class and the local elites in these countries, and the poor are neglected. And there was a time, the point is that I'm trying to make is that there was a time when the left with the anti-globalization movement actually addressed this stuff because the poverty in these countries, not to mention all the violence instigated by decades of CIA meddling in Central and South America, the violence, the poverty, the civil wars, that's what these immigrants are fleeing, coming here for a better life. There was a time where there was also an anti-war movement in this country during the Iraq War, you know, and when Obama came along, you saw the disappearance of both the anti-war movement and also the anti-globalization movement. And I think it really changed when Obama was elected. And there's a lot of historical amnesia about this because um, one of the things I wanted to discuss in 2018, this was after the 2016 election, where uh, Donald Trump had squared off against Hillary Clinton. So this is taking place in that context. Hillary had campaigned in support of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which basically, if you looked at that proposed trade agreement, it would have been like NAFTA 2.0. And you had Trump opposing it. I mean, during the Democratic primaries in 2016, Bernie Sanders had very much opposed TPP because he rightly acknowledged that it would have been another trade deal to benefit multinational corporations, of course, to the detriment of workers and immigrants alike. It would have created an unfair advantage for countries with lower labor costs and just lead to this race to the bottom of in terms of wages and working conditions, and was just another trade agreement to make sure that corporations could consolidate power and exploit workers and resources worldwide. And it would have just caused even more outsourcing uh, and undermine national sovereignty. And so in the 2016 election, you had Trump opposing TPP. Hillary wasn't even campaigning in Wisconsin because she was so arrogant. And you had Trump standing in front of a factory saying, I'm going to bring your jobs back. Um, and Hillary wouldn't even go there. Now, of course, once Trump was elected, he didn't fulfill any of his promises to bring back U.S. manufacturing jobs, and he passed a trade deal that really wasn't much better than TPP. But nevertheless, it was a right-wing populist that came along that was able to capitalize on the fact that the Democratic nominee was supportive of TPP, and NAFTA had been passed under her husband, Bill Clinton, in the 90s. And so after that election took place, there was this journalist named Angela Nagle. She was actually an Irish writer and academic. And in this, I think it's a pro-Trump website or magazine. It's called American Affairs Journal. She published this article that was very explosive and controversial. It was called "The Left Case Against Open Borders," and the title is very provocative, and it made it very easy to attack because but I think if you actually read the article, it's not really advocating for against open borders per se, or it's certainly not supportive of any of the things that like ICE is doing or Trump's immigration policy. But and I think it was deliberately provocative, but the article basically talked about how a lot of the things I've just been saying about how the political right and people like Trump have taken the place of the left in terms of confronting the effects of globalization. Obviously, not in terms of caring about the effects of the effects of it on these countries and you know the things that's causing these immigrants to leave here. But he is addressing the grievances of American workers as far as the effects of globalization, in that he's advocating economic protectionism. And actually, she brings up in the article about how during the 2016 primaries, Bernie Sanders himself was attacked for, quote, sounding like Trump um, when he said that he opposed open borders as a big business and Koch brothers favored policy. And Bernie, in both of the instances he ran for president in 2016 and 2020, he advocated tariffs, and said that companies need to be punished for outsourcing jobs. And his version of tariffs would probably have been much better than Trump's, very haphazard and seems to be more about punishing countries like China or punishing countries in terms of trade and trying to trigger a trade war with China than actually punishing the companies that are doing the outsourcing. Um, but they are at least trying to give some sort of incentive to have companies return, manufacturing to the United States. Um, but nevertheless, this article was raising a very important question about how the left at one time discussed globalization, and now that thunder has been stolen by right-wing populism. And of course, they call it globalism, that we have this elite rulers in this country who are favoring that don't care about American national sovereignty. They don't care about American workers, and they're just, you know, allowing. Also the other thing is that they have open borders, which is uh, allowing all these illegal immigrants to come here, and it's changing uh, American culture, and there's this uh, you know xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment in their, this right-wing populist take on globalization. But nevertheless, this article is talking about how the fact that it's only the right now that's talking about globalization being a problem at all, and the left is just completely neglecting it. And this journalist, Angela Nagle, she was mercilessly attacked. And I just looking it up this week, rereading it, it was a struggle to find any even media appearances with her. She went on Tucker Carlson to discuss it. He was pretty much the only person that invited her. And she was very eloquent on that show, regardless of what anyone wants to think about a left-wing journalist going on Fox News. And there were countless articles in the media, in the Nation magazine, um, tons of shows like these popular pseudo left shows like Majority Report with Sam Cedar. There was just a barrage of attacks on her, building this straw man argument, that she was somehow anti-immigration. And yes, there are some things about the criticisms of the article you could make, like the fact that she doesn't talk enough about imperialism. But it's mostly the article is about economic the U.S. economic policies that are impacting um, third world countries and causing, driving the immigration crisis. It mostly focuses on neoliberal economic policy, and it makes some very important points.
Yeah, I read the article and I thought it was pretty good. And it's especially telling when you look up like the George Bush Policy Institute had a whole thing about supporting completely open borders. And I think that right there is telling. And it's funny because when you hear these right-wing descriptions of the things that are going on presently or the globalist elites and whatnot, or the globalism in general, and the even they'll call it the communism, a lot
Mhm.
of what they're describing, if you just change the words out, they're just basically describing what Marx described about capitalism and Lenin elaborated with about imperialism. So it's kind of funny. You see those get distorted into this almost cinematic version.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that of course, they're scapegoating the immigrants for it, and they are right. We do, in the sense that we do have an elite that runs this country that doesn't care about American workers, but
The immigrants are not your enemies.
yeah,
It's the ruling class that is your enemies. And no, I think that the way these anti-separatists are being portrayed in the media and with just the general feeling of the times, I guess. Like I know there was a photograph of someone wearing like a Soviet flag as a cape, kind of standing over a burning police car. And when you show that to most people, especially with the sort of anti-communist fervor that's been going on, it's just going to contribute. Oh, see, the communists are destroying the country. They're making the country burn. So I think that whoever did that, if assuming they weren't some sort of a plant, it was a very foolish photo op. And in my view.
Well, it was probably somebody, I mean, I know that, I mean, PSL and Answer and all them are really being scapegoated. I mean, but it probably was somebody from there. I don't think it's a plan. I mean, I've been to many protests myself where I've seen people draped in, waving the Soviet flag, even though it's a protest that's about immigration and whatnot. And yeah, I mean, of course, the media is going to capitalize on that and say, it's these communists are rioting, but unfortunately, it probably was actually authentic. I mean, of course, yeah, sure, police do infiltrate protests, and I do think that there's a lot of funny business going on with these protests. I mean, I don't know what kind of person burns a cop car or a Waymo self-driving car or whatever, and then poses for photographs afterwards. I mean, the pictures are amazing. Don't get me wrong, but like, I mean, didn't these people pay attention in 2020? I mean, after the George Floyd protests, there were tons of people, who burned down cop cars and of course stupidly brought their phones along with them. But with the surveillance technology that they have, they're going to track each and every person down. They're going to comb through the footage. They're going to find you. You're going to do significant jail time. I mean, I really don't advise that people do this stuff. I mean, it's really quite foolish, but it's just this false dilemma, I think really is what's being presented here. And at the end of the day, for both of the two major parties, this is just a staged game where immigration is being used as a political football to be tossed back and forth. And they just put on this show for the voting public. Um, I mean, the political right uses it to weaponize, lingering racial prejudices lurking in American society, where all the ills of today, really capitalism, can be placed at the foot of this influx of immigrants. And it just becomes this big machinery of distraction, really. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to understand if this country's economy couldn't withstand an influx of migrants, they wouldn't be coming themselves, or they wouldn't stay very long. They would pick up and leave. I mean, people whose situation is so bad that they're willing to drag their family all the way here. And in the case of the so-called illegal immigrants, they're using terribly dangerous methods of travel through dangerous territory. In the case of refugees, I mean, migrants on boats where they're risking drowning. I mean, you always read about these boats coming from Africa, drowning, hundreds obtain safety and security for their families. Um, but regardless of the lies coming from the right-wing media about the whole nature of immigration, most of these refugees fleeing war or poverty, uh, caused by Western imperialism, most of them are only heading for the U.S. or anywhere that offers some level of safety. And, we don't really have a right to complain if the victims of our government's policies want to come here. I mean, considering we've stolen their wealth and extracted their resources, these people are just following what's been taken from them, as far as I'm concerned. So for the political right, instead of complaining about the immigrants, the priority should be to stop our government from destroying these countries and expropriating their resources in the first place. We live in the imperial core, and we're in a much better position to get rid of this ruling class. And that's a burden that we're going to have to be willing to shoulder at some point if this issue is ever going to be resolved. I mean, as for immigration in general, I mean, the right wing also has this ridiculous theory about, replacement. Um, and, there is like tiny kernels of truth to it, in the sense that, yes, in the United States, in much of the Western world, the birth rate is falling dramatically, and that is a serious problem. I agree. But that's not because of immigration. I mean, yes, immigration may correlate with it, but the reason that birth rates are declining is because people are poor. The welfare state has been dismantled. And yes, that's related to deindustrialization, the outsourcing of jobs. Um, More and more people in this country are postponing having a family if they do at all. And when they do finally have one, they're having less kids. Um, but the response by the right is just to demonize immigrants who make a vital contribution to the economy. And like I said earlier, it's debatable whether immigration really keeps wages low, but I mean, there probably is some truth to it. But regardless of that, they're a source of cheap labor and are easily exploitable. Um, and it's a false dilemma. I mean, wages have stagnated, period, since the 70s. And yes, the fertility rate is declining, by the end of the century, it's supposed to really plummet and only continue to. Um, but how are we going to, I mean, this is a serious problem. I mean, but again, like the immigration issue and globalization, it's only the right that's talking about it. Um, I mean, this is a serious issue. Like, how are we going to care for a population that's getting increasingly older? And how are we going to pay for the care of older people, without the tax payments that the government would be getting if the ratio of working people stayed the same, with each generation shrinking after the next? This is a big crisis. And now that, especially now that retirement benefits like Social Security and Medicare are on the chopping block, that's just going to fan the flames of that. But again, it's only the right that's talking about this stuff. What is the left's, if you even talk about a declining birth rate
I
or
think
any of that, you're a fucking Nazi automatically, according to the fake left. So,
I think it's ironic because the left today acts so concerned with the rise of the right, but the whole reason I think with the rise of the right is because the left has in some ways really failed and become like pro-imperialist and pro-neoliberal globalization almost,
mhm,
which then, those policies hurt a lot of ordinary people, which then pushes them to the right. So it's this dynamic, it's not just like people are crazy and they're moving more towards the right. No, the left has become so almost absurd. And of course, we can't discount the intelligence agency's role in that
mhm.
over the past decades, but still. And that's the thing too with the protests. Like, there's the whole communization theory, which is sort of like the ultra leftist theory that communism will manifest itself somehow through these spontaneous protests and that will pave the way of new collective ways of being or something. But, you know, most likely these protests are going to justify more surveillance, a crackdown. And now I know I've seen things trying to say now they're trying to blame China for these protests, and the FBI is investigating this.
Well, yeah, and that's very disturbing because, like we were talking about PSL earlier and answer. I mean, there is like the whole thing is that, I mean, not just answer and PSL, but like in workers' world, but Code Pink, these groups. There is this billionaire philanthropist. His name is Neville Roy Singham, that is to sponsor a lot of these groups, and of course the fact that the gunman at the Israeli embassy workers shooting, he was, I guess, affiliated with PSL. So there's this fear mongering going on, and almost like a new kind of like, seemingly like a new COINTELPRO targeting the left. So people need to be very vigilant and wary. Um, you know, I have a lot of problems with this Singham guy just because of the way that those groups are very backwards on a lot of social issues, and they are a problem. I have a lot of issues with them, but this state crackdown that seems to be imminent, uh, those groups are probably getting infiltrated, and who knows? There's a real war on the left right now, and they are seemingly being singled out. So people need to be stay vigilant. But you know, again, like there's this mistaken idea, I mean, in regards to the anti-immigrant sentiment that, and it's thanks to the political right, about immigration being inherently bad, or that the crises that I was just talking about, like with the declining birth rate and also, the issue around wages and whatnot, that they're somehow connected with immigration. And you can't blame workers who've worked hard their whole life and paid taxes and are expecting to be able to retire when they get older, for falling for this to some extent. And then, of course, it's made easier by the fact that there are less young people and the immigrant population is growing. So people are connecting these dots when it's not necessarily the case. But I think that from the left wing point of view, we need to go beyond these empty liberal slogans that just feed into that perception, about open borders, or that no one is illegal. And we need to do more than just express compassion for those who've arrived here, leaving their countries of origin to seek work far away from home. And there is a certain naivete also about immigration as far as like liberal multiculturalism goes, this romanticization of immigration, because after all, I mean, not really in the case of Central and South America, but many of these migrants are coming from places where, especially in a precarious economic situation, they're not going to really be able to assimilate, or they're going to have difficulty doing so. And especially if you add on top of that factors like they come from places where there might be a very different religion and value system and cultural attitudes, and if they get here in a very bad economic situation that might not permit them to learn the official language fluently, and keeps them in this marginalized position, and they can't really assimilate. And if you couple that with, like, for example, in Europe and the United States, the refugee crisis, like a lot of these people are coming from places that have been ravaged by civil wars, that are the direct result of U.S. foreign policy and the support for terrorist groups. The migration is often served as like a Trojan horse, and like facilitated like a lot of blowback in terms of terrorism. I mean, you had the Manchester bombing, uh, the Ariana Grande concert where, um, the perpetrator of that bombing had been in a group that was supported by NATO. And I mean, we were talking about Libya, the intervention in Libya last week. I mean, there have been numerous instances of people who, served in these like terrorist proxies in foreign countries, coming back and, you know, hiding amongst the um, refugees coming here and then committing terrorist attacks, which only fuels the Islamophobia among the far right in Europe and the United States.
Well,
Um, and as far as Central and South America goes, these countries that have been ravaged by civil war and political instability, thanks to decades of American meddling. We've seen similar effects with like these street gangs. Like the US has been meddling in places like Venezuela and El Salvador for years. And the mass migrations fleeing these countries have coincided with the expansion of these criminal gangs like MS-13, for example, in El Salvador. The CIA's support for death squads,
well that
um,
well that's
the legacy of the violence that and civil war we create there, that laid the groundwork for stuff like MS-13.
well that's where I think that you can't even frame the whole immigration issue correctly unless you look at in like imperialism. And I think that's one of the biggest, almost biggest misconceptions on the right about it, is that they act like it's somehow easy to immigrate. and don't address, these people are desperate because their countries have been ravaged by US imperialism for a long time now. And that's really the main issue. But as to, I feel like some of the, again, I guess going back to some of the problems with the left is that there isn't any, in a class struggle. I think it was in one of his talks, Michael Prenti was saying how, the ruling class, they also wage class struggle. They struggle for their interests. And if we're having this sort of class warfare, you're not going to have very good strategy if you're just about empty moralizing slogans about having compassion, these other things, and not thinking about situations analytically from a big picture perspective, or thinking about, long term results. And that's the thing with, I guess that you'd say the problems with protests in general is that it doesn't oftentimes create meaningful results in the long term. It can verge on becoming more performative, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that those sort of characteristics definitely are all over these protests. I mean, it's just this idea, this very naive idea that like protesting per se, or that this kind of rioting is going to produce real substantive social change. It's very historically, if you look at history, that's really not the case. Um, and I do think that, I mean, I'm not saying that people shouldn't protest. I don't want to see a bunch of comments, saying that, we're just saying that people should stay home. Of course not. But I think people just need to stay vigilant as far as the methods of protesting and how this is just feeding into this very obviously uh, eager. I mean, they're very eager to crack down on the left right now.
Well, that's where there's time. Every timing is everything. And it's like a few episodes ago, and we were discussing the Israeli embassy shooting versus the Mangione shooting, and how like the embassy shooting was not well timed. And that's, I think, with protests too, you have to think about the timing of it within the
Yeah,
general context.
definitely. Definitely. And speaking of timing, I mean, I think it's no coincidence, like the way that these No Kings protests roll out. I mean, people want to talk about a color revolution. That is, I think that the ICE protests are something that's genuine and organic, that's being manipulated and turned into something. Whereas these No Kings protests is completely inauthentic. It's just straight up astroturfing. The
Weren't they?
money behind it, this 50-51 movement. I mean, there was a Walmart heiress that took out a full page ad in the New York Times promoting it. And, clearly like one of the demands is to resume military aid to Ukraine. I mean, this is just straight up, that if you want to talk about a color revolution, that is the kind of thing. Whereas I think that like BLM in 2020, people are legitimately upset about the ICE raids, and rightly so, but it's being manipulated and transformed into something else.
Yes, I agree. No, the No Kings protests are just a joke, in my opinion. I mean, it's kind of like it's a bit similar to the hands-off protests with, hands off
It's a direct extension of that.
US aid and NATO because NATO is so great.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this has been a great discussion. And I want to remind our viewers and listeners to hit like and subscribe wherever you're watching, whether it's on YouTube or our Substack. And also, please leave comments. We want to get feedback from you. Shaenah, did you have any other final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to add thank you. Have gotten some really nice comments on YouTube, and thank you to the people for making that. It's good to hear from you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Captive Minds.